Good morning, everyone. Great to see you here. It is a joy this morning to have the opportunity to speak to you about what I consider the most beautiful teaching of Pope Francis. We've all heard about the theology of the body from John Paul II, and I think that what we can consider a gift that we have received and will be receiving in years to come from Pope Francis could be called the theology of aging. I might have missed this teaching. I might have not even noticed this precise set of catecheses if not for being in Rome, living in Rome at the time that he was giving them. But I was studying in Rome, I was studying the resurrection of the dead for a couple of years in Rome, and I was going to some of these Wednesday audiences, and they really touched my heart. Pope Francis gave 18 Wednesday audiences in 2022 on the meaning and value of old age in Scripture. Here a little feedback stuff. Anything we can do about that? Okay, great. So he gave these 18 Wednesday audiences on the meaning and value of old age in Scripture, and they got my attention. Part of that is because, as I mentioned yesterday, I had a really warm, moving, formative relationship with my own grandfather. Throughout my high school and early university years, he lived with my family, and that was tremendously formative. So much so that often on my parents' wedding anniversary, I write to them and I thank them specifically for the gift of bringing my grandfather into our home to live with us in those years. And I think it was one of the most beautiful things within their marriage for me to observe as a young person growing up. The sacrifices that it entailed, to be sure, and also the way that it kind of multiplied the love within our family. And definitely the stories. But it wasn't only my own grandfather who had such a tremendous and formative impact on me. There were other people like grandparents in my life, and there still are, who tremendously shaped me. For example, when I was 18, I went on a Holocaust study trip to Germany and Poland with 60 students from all across Canada and 2 Holocaust survivors, Pinchas and Fegi. And these survivors were in their 80s, they had been children during the Holocaust, and they traveled with us, and we walked hand in hand, visiting the concentration camps, standing before the places at which they were separated from their families or at which their families were taken from them and killed. And I was so struck that they thought we were worth it. It was worth returning to the site of their trauma and loss and giving a message to us to carry forward, and also entrusting us with the responsibility to be their witnesses for what they had experienced and endured. And it was during that trip that I learned that dehumanization is at the core of genocide. And ever since then, this has been a defining thread of continuity throughout my life, that I've wondered, if dehumanization is at the core of genocide, what then does it mean to humanize humanity? So I was very struck when the first Wednesday audience of Pope Francis had so many similar themes. He said, we've never had so many old people living in the world as now, and that old age is one of the defining issues of our time. He also said that the discarding and discounting of those in old age is a defining image from the 20th century. Is it going to be one in the 21st century? Or can we resist the dehumanization through the discarding, discounting, and dismissing of life in the 21st century and write a new story? So that pulse on these issues that had so shaped my own attention to life issues and my own passion for the faith, I really saw and heard Pope Francis speaking to. And Pope Francis began this catechetical journey that seeks inspiration from Scripture on the meaning and value of old age, began right after a series on St. Joseph. And what links these reflections to Pope Francis's mind is the theme of dreams. Of course, the motif of dreams throughout St. Joseph. And then he starts his catechetical series on old age, talking about the prophet Joel, saying, your old men will dream dreams, and the young men will see visions. And he makes this very concrete and practical. And he says, when the old fall back on their melancholies, the young will look more and more to their smartphones. If the young are not capable of receiving the dreams of the old, if there isn't a clarity, if there isn't a horizon, if we aren't presented with some sense of our destiny by those who hand on the faith or are intended to, then the young people will lack vision. So I was captivated by that as well. Pope Francis himself, how did he come to this? Why was he so focused on this theme of intergenerational solidarity? Why was he so adamant, as he said, that the alliance between old and young will save the human family? That's a bold statement. And partly, I can assure you, it is because this is his own testimony. It's so true for him that he had to spread it to the universal church. Pope Francis, if he's asked to name someone, the first person who comes to mind, he would say his grandmother, Rosa. From his grandmother, he received the faith in a particularly poignant way that he never ceased addressing and giving thanks for. And it was that grandmother who, when Pope Francis was a young boy, told him a story that stayed with him for decades. It was the story of a family, a mother, father, and their many children, and a grandfather who lived at the home with them. Well, they were having dinner, and because this grandfather was quite old by then, he was starting to be really messy as he ate. The napkin would get covered his mouth, he was drooling. It was not a pretty sight. And so the father decided that from now on, the grandfather would eat at his own table in the kitchen, while the rest of the family stayed in the dining room. And so this went on for some days. And one day the father came home and he saw one of the youngest sons playing with a block of wood and asked him what he was doing. And the son said, "Well, I'm playing carpenter." And the father said, "What are you building, son?" And he said, "I'm building a table, Papa, for when you get old like Grandpa." Pope Francis told that story several times throughout his pontificate, inserting it in different addresses and audiences, saying that it was told to him when he was young. And from that, decades and decades later, we can trace the heading in his letter to young people that begins with the words, "Your relationship to the elderly." These experiences gave him his horizon, his orientation, and it became such a capacity for testimony about what Pope Francis has so much evocative language. And we are just beginning, I believe, to mine these gems of his pontificate. And maybe now we will begin to receive them in the way that God has meant them for us all along. Pope Francis has beautiful phrases like, he says there's a magisterium of frailty. What does he mean by that? It's a mysterious and evocative term. But I think we can see how much he, by being a pope in a wheelchair, by going to the door, by all these images throughout the pandemic, bore witness to the evangelization that happens in our weakness. So that was one of the first audiences from the prophet Joel, but he looks at all these different figures throughout Scripture. And he has so many beautiful things to say about the symphony between generations. I also like very much how he speaks about the distinct responsibilities for different demographics. He says to the young people are responsible for combating the elderly's tendency toward pessimism through affectionate pressure. Affectionate pressure. What a beautiful term. Especially we as Canadians would do well to cultivate some of this affectionate pressure, which, if I think about where this is modeled particularly well in Scripture, it's with the story of Zacchaeus. Do you ever think about how Jesus says, "I must come to your house today"? He doesn't say, maybe we'll maybe we'll do lunch, or send me a calendar invite sometime. No, I must come to your house today. And when do we do that? When do we do that with loving insistence, when we resist those thoughts in our mind that maybe I'm imposing, maybe this person doesn't want me to see them, maybe I shouldn't go to that funeral, maybe it's only for the family, maybe I don't want to impose. No, affectionate pressure. And for the elderly, he says, the vocation of the elderly is to remind young people that they are a blessing. The vocation of the elderly is to remind the young that they are a blessing. I have a friend who gives pro-life talks in Ontario schools, and he says invariably when he's giving talks, he'll have an experience where someone says, my life is terrible, my family is a mess, I wish I was never born, so of course I support abortion. To which my friend will say, well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that didn't happen. You have a task in the world. You have something that your life is meant to be about. To which the young person will say something like, nobody's ever told me that. There's such a hunger and a yearning to be affirmed, the right kind of affirmation. We've spoken a lot throughout the weekend about some of these sham forms of affirmation, but there's something legitimate and noble and real and deep and human about our need in every stage of life to be affirmed, to concur with God, you are good, it's good you exist. And Pope Benedict used to say, the fundamental tenor of faith is affirmatory, and faith lives on affirmation. So young people to combat the elderly's tendency toward pessimism through affectionate pressure, and older people to remind the young that they are a blessing, to hand on dreams to the young so that the young have vision and clarity about where to set their own gaze as they go throughout the world. There's so many beautiful lines also about tenderness. He speaks about how young people are not capable of showing affection the way that the elderly do. We all know it. If you're with an older person, there can be that tendency where they take your hands, often both of them, and they'll hold them for the entire conversation. And it's not even weird. If anyone my age did that, it'd be super weird. But it's so natural, it's so humanizing. And so Pope Francis speaks about this revolution of tenderness and how these gestures of the elderly are capable of expressing tenderness in ways that are credible to the young, that are credible and humanizing, that are this touch of love for which people are profoundly parched. I love his reflections on these different nuances in discernment between young and old as well. Young people, he says, are often encouraged to ask the question, who am I? And fair enough. We all go through a time of searching and trying to know ourselves, and this is a dimension of our discernment. But Pope Francis wants to lead us to a more mature reflection about our identity, which is connected to our mission. And Pope Francis says that after you've considered the question, who am I? The mature question to which you can graduate is the question, for whom am I? For whom am I? I mentioned that Holocaust study trip earlier. This just occurred to me before getting up here. And the very first thing that we were shown when we got to Berlin, I'll never forget this, was the missing house. What was it? It was literally a space between apartments that was missing. The whole apartment complex was gone, and it had been just completely eliminated, and all the people who had been in it killed and deported and things like this. The missing house. And so the question was, will you pay attention not only to what you see in terms of the grand monuments, but will you pay attention to what is missing? And what I would encourage all of you, having received so many gifts and so many graces through your family, through your faith, through this conference, who is missing from here? Look at the empty spaces and think about all of the people who are not here. I don't just mean because they went home early or anything like that. I mean, who do we have to be for? For whom are we? How are we going out to the isolated, abandoned, to the people who are without family? Pope Francis always encouraged us to have a broader, expansive vision of family. I remember thinking about widows and orphans in Scripture sounding almost anachronistic, sounding like something from, well, biblical times. But then it occurred to me that this is a common reality. Anyone who has a spouse die before them, then they're a widow or a widower. And so we have tons of widows and widowers all around us. It's not just like a biblical image. And orphans, well, people's parents die. And then, even as an adult, you experience that experience of being orphaned in this sense. Do we think today in our church, with this kind of attention to widows, widowers, orphans, or does it seem like something from the past? There's so many more phrases in Pope Francis's catecheses. He's just got all this evocative imagery and these different biblical exemplars, whether it's Moses or Anna and Simeon, and he's unpacking different biblical figures, but he's also unpacking different themes throughout the Bible, talking about a generative presence. So this language is amazing. It's so good for your prayer. It's so good for your meditation. You can simply go Vatican, Pope Francis, catecheses, old age. It's easy to find. Maybe it should be easier. One thing that really struck me, just to give you an example of the kinds of figures to whom and to which Pope Francis is pointing, maybe I had heard this story before, but it didn't catch my attention until Pope Francis really unpacked it. It's the story of the martyrdom of Eleazar in Maccabees. I love this story, and it sounds, in a certain sense, so palpable and so kind of present to me now. So I'm going to read from the story of the martyrdom of Eleazar, and I want to invite you to think specifically of what comes to mind in terms of the witness that the elderly, those in old age, Pope Francis said, everyone's going to be offended. I talk about the elderly, I talk about old age. No one wants to think it applies to them. He started varying his language, and he said, maybe I'll say, my dear contemporaries. So it's sweet. He always says, my dear contemporaries, this is for you. So consider what Pope Francis, consider this martyrdom of Eleazar from Scripture that I'm going to read, and think about what is instructive for you in terms of the witness of longevity of faith that does not renege, that does not recant, even under pressure and even later in life. So here is the reading. Like a millennial, I'm reading it from my smartphone. Okay. The martyrdom of Eleazar. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh as all ought to go who have the courage to refuse things that it is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. Those who were in charge of that unlawful sacrifice took the man aside because of their long acquaintance with him, and privately urged him to bring meat of his own providing, proper for him to use, and to pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meal that had been commanded by the king, so that by doing he might be saved from death and be treated kindly on account of his long acquaintance with them. But making a high resolve, worthy of his years and the dignity of his old age and the gray hairs that he had reached with distinction, and his excellent life, even from childhood, and moreover, according to the holy God-given law, he declared himself quickly telling them to send him to Hades. Such pretense is not worthy of our time of life, he said, for many of the young might suppose that Eleazar in his 90th year had gone over to an alien religion. And through my pretense, for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they would be led astray because of me, while I defile and disgrace my old age. Even if, for the present, I would avoid the punishment of mortals, yet, whether I live or die, I will not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by bravely giving up my life now, I will show myself worthy of my old age, and leave to the young a noble example of how to die a good death, willingly and nobly, for the revered and holy laws. When he said that, he went at once to the rack. Those who a little before had acted toward him with goodwill now changed to ill will, because the words he had uttered were, in their opinion, sheer madness. When he was about to die under the blows, he groaned and said, "It is clear to the Lord in his holy knowledge that, though I might have been saved from death, I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating, but in my soul I am glad to suffer these things because I fear him." And so, in this way, he died, leaving in his death an example of nobility and a memorial of courage, not only to the young, but to the great body of the nation. We can think about this in so many present contexts. How will we die deaths that are noble and a memorial of courage? If you're wondering how to address these end-of-life issues and topics of suffering in a secular or more natural law way, I would encourage you to ask those in your life, who do you admire? Who do you consider exemplary? Tell me about a marriage you admire. Tell me about a death you admire. And I guarantee you that people will point to the good and the true and the beautiful, and that they will fix their eyes on examples that exceed their own lives, and that their yearnings will be improved. And similarly, if someone is tempted to euthanasia, or if they're really having a difficult time bearing their own sufferings in any respect, even in the course of our ordinary days, I would encourage you to come alongside that person with a posture, maybe you put it in different words, but with a posture that says, "What do you have to teach me? What do you have to teach me?" Because when you have that posture of curiosity, putting the person in a position of a teacher, they cannot help but exceed themselves and excel themselves. I had the opportunity to visit a couple prisoners serving life sentences in a federal prison. And toward the end of our time together, they had been looking pretty downcast and sharing, but it was pretty difficult for them. Toward the end of the visit, I asked one of the men, both of them were indigenous, and I asked him, if you had the opportunity to go to the place you grew up and give a message to young people, what would you say? I wish I could describe to you. He sat up, he looked up, and he started to speak like a motivational high school speaker. I was floored. Don't listen to what people say about you. You can achieve anything. Make sure you get your license. Make sure you don't drink. Make sure. He was so animated. And it was a complete transformation. And we all have the capacity to elicit that kind of exceeding whatever is in us to give, going beyond our own reserves and having more to offer because we do will the good of the others in our lives, even the ones we're just imaginatively speaking to and addressing. So I do encourage you very much to also think about the deaths that you've experienced that are a kind of Eleazar death, where there was no sacrifice of fidelity, but where the person loved well and faithfully until their last breath, leaving that example of nobility and that memorial of courage. And speak about these things. Speak about these things to the rising generation to clarify that our lives are high stakes and have elevating expectations of others, because that will raise people up and combat the dehumanization in our time. So I hope this whets your appetite a little bit to find this treasure from Pope Francis's pontificate. We are going to continue to see it expounded upon, certainly by Pope Leo, and already seeing that in some of his recent Wednesday audiences. He's touching on how can you give food to your children? How can you nourish them spiritually if you yourself are not always ongoingly formed? So, yeah, I'm a pretty big fan of Pope Francis's theology of aging, and I hope those reflections are fruitful for you and your families. God bless.